So Anne did at first reject Henry's advances, and that was part of the reason that he was interested in her. But she also had an upper hand because she had spent much of her early life in different courts in Europe. So from 1513 to 1514, she was in modern day Belgium with Margaret of Austria. In 1514, she traveled to the French court with Henry's sister, Mary Tudor, to prepare her for her wedding to the French king. And finally, she was employed in the service of French Queen Claude from 1515 to 1521 before returning to England. So this made her stand out with learned wit and charm, and many courtiers said she seemed a French woman born. So again, she did originally reject Henry's advances because she didn't want to settle for the position of mistress, and her sister Mary Boleyn had been his mistress for a short amount of time, and then she was discarded. So she just wanted more for herself, and she used the king's lust for her to eventually gain the position of queen. So after she became queen, though, she only grew bolder in her pursuits of power. So when the king sought mistresses, she grew jealous and controlling, and that irritated Henry because it was strange to him, especially because she hadn't given birth to a son. Also, when she was in the Tower, she may have written one final letter to Henry. It is a bit controversial because it was found after she died in the belongings of Thomas Cromwell, but there's also a lot of evidence that points to her writing it. So, in that letter, she would have said, "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges." She also pleaded for the lives of the others accused, whom she calls those innocent gentlemen. Just before her execution as well, Anne was displaying her innocence when receiving the Eucharist. So when the priest allowed her to confess any final sins, she stated that she had not, with her body, offended against the king upon the eternal damnation of her soul. Whoever's efforts, be they Cromwell's or those of another, as she did have a bit of a rivalry with Cromwell towards the end of her life, whoever's efforts those were directed towards the destruction of Anne Boleyn proved that she was a formidable enemy inside the previously untouched political sphere for women, and they felt that they had to get rid of her. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, her motto was bound to obey and serve. She was the complete and polar opposite of Anne Boleyn, and that's really what drew Henry to her. Anne had given Henry a lot of trouble and was never afraid to argue with him, while Jane, on the other hand, was the embodiment of her motto. Where Anne was sharp tongued and frank, Jane was meek and humble. She was willing to be subservient to Henry in a way that Anne was not. Much like Anne rejected the king's proposal, Jane also refused to become his mistress. According to Antonia Fraser, a historian, she, as in Jane, refused to accept a gift of gold sovereigns from the king, flinging herself on her knees and begging a messenger to tell the king that she was a gentlewoman of fair and honorable lineage without reproach, and that she had nothing in the world but her honor, with which for 1,000 deaths she would not wound, and therefore she must return the gift. And if the king deigned to make her a present of money, she prayed that it might be when she make an honorable marriage. So it is impossible to tell whether Jane did this for the purpose of winning the king's affections, but regardless, she did catch his eye. So, after the king promised to marry Jane, she began working towards the reinstatement of the Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's only surviving child with Henry. This was due to the fact that Jane was both a fervent Catholic behind closed doors and an avid supporter of the late Queen. Chapuis, the Spanish ambassador to Charles V and close friend of Mary, wrote, "The king speaking with Mistress Jane of their future marriage. The latter suggested that the princess should be replaced in her former position, and the king told her she was a fool and ought to solicit the advancement of the children they would have between them and not any others." But Jane did overall provide Henry with the son that he really, really wanted. So Henry's fourth and probably most overlooked wife is Anne of Cleves. Her motto is "God send me well to keep." She is remembered in history as Henry's ugliest wife, the one he couldn't bear to remain married to because she was so unattractive. In reality, though, Anne's intelligence resulted in her having arguably the best life of all of Henry's wives. Regardless of how pleased Henry was with the marriage, when he quickly moved his intentions to the young